Welcome back, guys. Imagine stepping back in time to a place where the very foundations of civilization seem to be crumbling beneath your feet. Picture yourself in Berlin, April 1945, where the 1,000-year Reich that was promised to last a millennium is now counting its final days in weeks, perhaps hours. The city that once pulsed with the rhythms of empire now trembles under a different kind of rhythm. Entirely the constant thunder of artillery shells and the whistle of bombs falling from a gray, smoke-filled sky. Please consider subscribing to the channel and drop a comment below. You find yourself in a world where the most basic elements of human existence have become luxuries almost beyond reach, where a single loaf of bread represents not just sustenance, but hope itself, where the sound of footsteps in the rubble might mean salvation or doom, depending on the language spoken by their owner. This is Berlin in its death throes, a city caught between the hammer and anvil of history, with millions of ordinary people trapped within its dying embrace. Tonight, we'll walk together through these final, desperate weeks, experiencing what it meant to be human in a place where humanity itself seemed to be under siege. We'll descend into the bomb shelters and cellars where families huddled in the darkness, listening to the world above them tear itself apart. We'll witness the fall of symbols and the collapse of certainties that had defined an entire generation. We'll read the private thoughts of those who lived through these impossible days, their words preserved like pressed flowers between the pages of history, and we'll glimpse, too, the strange parallel world that existed in the depths below, the city where the architects of this catastrophe continued their rituals and delusions, even as everything they had built turned to ash and rubble above their heads. Settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare to journey back to a time when the very concept of tomorrow had become uncertain, and survival was measured not in years or months, but in the precious currency of individual days. The morning light filtering through the broken windows of apartment. For beyond Wilhelmstrasse carries with it more than illumination. It carries the fine gray dust that has become the signature of Berlin in these final days. Imagine yourself waking in this space that was once someone's carefully tended home, now transformed into something resembling a cave carved from civilization's debris. The wallpaper, once perhaps a cheerful pattern of roses or geometric designs, hangs in strips like peeling skin, revealing patches of cracked plaster beneath that tell their own story of violent nights and trembling walls. Your bed is not a bed in any sense you might recognize, but rather a collection of salvaged materials, a door torn from its hinges and balanced on two wooden crates, covered with whatever fabric could be gathered from the ruins. A coat that once kept someone warm during a Christmas market stroll now serves as a blanket. The pillow beneath your head might be a bundle of newspapers, their headlines from happier times now serving the purely practical purpose of cushioning sleep. The irony is not lost on you that your head rests upon promises of victory that have long since turned to ash. The cold creeps up through the floorboards, which are no longer entirely whole, where gaps have opened between the wooden planks, can see down into the apartment below, also destroyed. It's also inhabited by shadows of families who once called this building home. The cold is not merely the absence of warmth, it is an active presence, a living thing that settles into your bones and makes every movement an act of deliberation. Your breath forms small clouds, even inside this shelter, and you've learned to conserve your body heat by moving slowly, deliberately, like someone walking underwater. Water comes from a single tap in what was once a bathroom, though the bathroom itself exists now only in memory. The tap produces water sporadically, and when it does flow, the liquid carries the taste of rust and debris. It's flavored with the mineral essence of broken pipes and disturbed earth. You've learned to collect every precious drop in containers salvaged from the wreckage. A chipped teacup here, a dented pot there, even a boot if necessary. The ritual of checking these containers has become one of the small ceremonies that structured your day. Moments of hope when you discover that the night's collection has yielded enough water for both drinking and the luxury of washing your face. The kitchen exists now only as a memory embodied in a small camping stove, itself a treasure found in the ruins of a sporting goods store. Fuel for this stove is more precious than jewelry, and you measure it out in tiny portions, enough to heat water for ersatz coffee made from acorns and chicory, or to warm a thin soup crafted from whatever edibles can be scavenged from the urban wasteland that Berlin has become. The act of cooking has been reduced to its most elemental form, the application of heat. Two raw materials in hopes of creating something that will sustain life for another day. Your neighbors in this vertical village of broken apartments are people you might never have met under normal circumstances. There's the elderly professor from the second floor, a man who once lectured on German literature to packed university halls, is now sharing his space with a family of strangers because his own apartment lacks a roof. His voice, when he speaks, carries the measured cadence of academic discourse, but the words he chooses are practical now discussions of which buildings might still have intact cellars, which streets remain passable, where one might find uncontaminated water. The family with 3 young children has claimed the corner apartment on the 3rd floor, the one with the least damage to its walls. The children have adapted to this new reality with a remarkable resilience that seems to be the exclusive province of the young. They play games among the rubble, creating imaginary worlds where broken bricks become castles and twisted metal becomes the infrastructure of elaborate fantasy realms. Their laughter, when it comes, sounds almost shocking in this environment. I sound so out of place that it takes you a moment to recognize it for what it is. Food arrives through a network of informal exchanges that operates like a shadow economy. Someone might trade a handful of potatoes discovered in the root cellar of a bombed grocery for a few pieces of coal that could provide warmth for an evening. A woman might exchange her skills as a seamstress, mending clothes with thread carefully unwoven from damaged garments for a share in someone else's meager meal. The currency of this economy is not money but need, and the exchange rates fluctuate based on the cruel mathematics of survival. The rats have become fellow residents rather than mere pests. They move through the walls and broken spaces with a confidence that suggests they understand this new world better than its human inhabitants. At night, you can hear them moving through their highways of destruction, occasionally sharing spaces with the humans who have learned to coexist rather than compete. There's a strange comfort in their presence. They represent life continuing, adaptation in real time, a reminder that survival takes many forms. Sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by sounds that penetrate even the deepest exhaustion. The distant rumble of artillery creates a bass note that seems to emanate from the earth itself. Its closest sounds are more personal, the crack of settling timbers in damaged buildings, the scrape of wind through broken windows, the soft conversations of other families dealing with their own versions of this impossible reality. You learn to distinguish between sounds that signal immediate danger and those that represent merely the ongoing soundtrack of a city in collapse. The rhythm of these days creates its own kind of routine, a structure built around the basic requirements of staying alive. Morning brings the careful assessment of what the night has brought or taken away, new damage to be worked around, new resources to be discovered or mourned. The middle hours of the day are spent in the careful work of survival, seeking food, water, fuel, information about what's happening in the larger world beyond these immediate needs. Evening brings the equally important work of securing shelter, sharing resources, and preparing for another night in a world where tomorrow has become a luxury rather than a given assumption. As the surface world becomes increasingly uninhabitable, you discover that Berlin has developed an entire civilization beneath the streets, a subterranean network of cellars, basements, bunkers, and subway tunnels that has become the true heart of the dying city. The journey downward begins with a descent through what was once the basement of your apartment building, but which now connects through broken walls and makeshift passages to a labyrinth that extends far beyond what any architect ever intended. The air down here carries a different quality than the smoke-filled atmosphere above ground. It's thick with the smell of damp concrete, unwashed bodies, and the peculiar metallic scent that seems to emanate from fear itself. The temperature remains more constant than in the exposed buildings above, though that constancy hovers somewhere between uncomfortably cool and genuinely cold. Your breath still forms small clouds. The wind doesn't cut through your clothing with the same vicious intensity that characterizes life above ground. The passages between these underground spaces have been created through necessity rather than design. Where basement walls have been damaged by bombing, people have carefully widened the gaps to create doorways. Where buildings have collapsed, the debris has been carefully moved to create tunnels. The result is a network that resembles the warrens of some enormous creature, with paths that follow the logic of survival rather than the orderly planning that once characterized Berlin's famous efficiency. Navigation in this underworld requires a completely different set of skills than moving through the city's former streets. You learn to identify passages by their smells. The corridor that leads toward the old subway station carries the metallic temps of the rails of the path. Toward the hospital basement maintains a faint antiseptic odor that somehow persists despite the absence of medical supplies. Sounds travel in unexpected ways through these spaces, echoing and amplifying in some areas while being completely absorbed in others, creating acoustic shadows where conversations can be conducted in privacy just a few meters away from larger groups. The sociology of this underground world operates according to its own unspoken rules. Families tend to cluster together in the larger spaces, creating small villages within the network. Single individuals often find themselves forming temporary alliances based on practical considerations. Someone who has managed to bring a portable stove might share warmth in exchange for a portion of someone else's food stores. These arrangements shift and evolve as circumstances change, creating a fluid social structure that adapts to the constant pressures of survival. Children have adapted to this underground existence with a creativity that borders on the miraculous. They've developed games that work within the confined spaces, turning the maze-like passages into elaborate playgrounds for hide-and-seek variations that would be impossible in the world above. Their voices, echoing through the concrete chambers, create a soundscape that sometimes makes it possible to forget, for brief moments, that this is a world defined by destruction rather than possibility. The elderly face particular challenges. In this environment, the constant dampness aggravates arthritis and other age-related ailments, while the uneven surfaces and improvised stairs make movement treacherous for those with mobility limitations. Yet many of them have become the informal librarians of this underground society, maintaining the oral histories of their neighborhoods, remembering which families have lost members and which ones are still hoping for news of missing relatives. Water sources in the underground network are precious beyond measure. A pipe that still carries clean water becomes the center of a small community, with informal schedules developed to ensure everyone has access while preventing the waste that could result from uncontrolled usage. The sound of water dripping becomes a form of music in this world, each drop representing potential life sustained for another hour. The darkness is nearly absolute in many areas, broken only by the occasional candle or improvised oil lamp. The scarcity of fuel means that light is used sparingly, creating pools of illumination separated by vast areas of blackness. Your eyes adapt to this environment gradually, learning to distinguish between different qualities of darkness, developing an ability to navigate by touch and memory that would have seemed impossible in your previous life. News from the outside. world filters down through this network in fragments and rumors. Someone who ventures above ground for scavenging might return with reports of which districts have fallen under Soviet control, or news about civilian columns attempting to flee westward. This information is shared through whispered conversations that spread through the tunnels like a slow-moving wave, each retelling adding its own interpretations and uncertainties to whatever facts might originally have been observed. The psychological impact of this underground existence varies dramatically from person to person. Some find comfort in the enclosed spaces, feeling safer surrounded by concrete and earth than they do under the open sky where bombers might appear at any moment. Others struggle with claustrophobia that becomes more intense with each passing day, fighting against the sense that they're being buried alive by circumstances beyond their control. Food preparation in these spaces requires innovation born of desperation. Cooking fires must be carefully managed to avoid creating smoke that might reveal the location of these refuges to hostile forces above. The lack of proper ventilation means that meals are often cold or warmed only slightly over carefully hoarded fuel sources. The communal nature of many meals creates a strange intimacy among strangers, sharing not just sustenance, but the fundamental human ritual of eating together, even under the most extreme circumstances. Privacy becomes a luxury redefined by necessity. Families learn to create artificial boundaries using hanging blankets or sheets, carving out tiny spaces within the larger chambers where they can maintain some sense of personal space. These improvised rooms become sanctuaries where people can experience brief moments of solitude, process their experiences privately, or simply exist without the constant awareness of others watching. The sounds of this underground world create their own rhythm. The constant drip of water, the rustle of clothing as people move through passages, the murmur of conversations conducted in lowered voices, the occasional cry of a child or cough from an elderly resident tile, these combined to create a soundscape that becomes as familiar as a heartbeat. Above these immediate sounds, the muffled thunder of artillery and bombing provides a constant reminder of the world above. Bass note that never entirely disappears, even in the deepest chambers. In this world, stripped of its former certainties, you discover that human beings create new rituals with the same instinctive necessity that they once created, the elaborate ceremonies of peacetime. These are not the grand rituals of state or religion, but the small essential practices that make it possible to remain human when humanity itself seems under siege. Each morning begins with the same careful inventory not of possessions in any conventional sense, but of the basic elements that determine whether another day of survival is possible. The ritual of checking water containers has become as sacred as any religious observance. You move through your small collection of improvised vessels with the same methodical attention that a priest might bring to preparing communion wine. Each container is examined not just for its contents, but for signs of contamination, for cracks that might allow precious liquid to escape, for the subtle changes in color or odor that might signal whether the water remains safe to drink. The sound of liquid moving in a container becomes music of a sort, each gentle slosh representing life extended for another day. Food preparation, when ingredients are available, involves ceremonies that would seem elaborate to an outside observer, but which serve essential psychological functions for those performing them. The careful division of a single potato among family members becomes an exercise in mathematical precision. Each slice measured not just for nutritional value, but for the fairness that maintains social cohesion in circumstances that could easily dissolve into chaos. The act of chewing has slowed to an almost meditative pace, each bite experienced fully before the next is taken, extracting every possible calorie and every moment of satisfaction from whatever nourishment can be obtained. The sharing of news and rumors follows patterns as formalized as any court protocol. Information travels through the underground network in carefully structured ways, with certain individuals emerging as trusted sources, while others are known to embellish or misinterpret what they've heard. The evening gathering, where these reports are shared, becomes a form of communal storytelling, with each narrator understanding their role in maintaining not just information flow, but the social bonds that make survival possible for the group, rather than merely for individuals. Personal hygiene, in circumstances where water is precious and privacy nearly non-existent, becomes a carefully choreographed dance of efficiency and modesty. The weekly wash, when enough water can be spared for such luxury, involves heated negotiations over privacy, timing, and the sharing of soap fragments that have been hoarded like precious metals. The simple act of combing one's hair with a broken comb becomes a statement of intention to continue existing as a human being rather than merely a survivor. Sleep rituals have evolved to accommodate the reality of shared spaces and constant vigilance. Families develop elaborate systems of signals for indicating when someone needs privacy for rest, when space should be cleared for a sick member, the common area should be kept quiet for those whose exhaustion has overcome their ability to sleep despite noise and disturbance. The arrangement and rearrangement of bedding becomes a nightly ceremony that transforms public space into something resembling private sanctuary. The maintenance of personal belongings, however few and damaged they might be, provides structure. 2 days that might otherwise dissolve into shapeless intervals of waiting and fear. A woman might spend precious daylight hours carefully mending a dress that has been torn by debris, using thread pulled from less essential garments, the act of sewing becoming a meditation that connects her to a time when such activities were choices rather than necessities. A man might spend similar time carefully sharpening a knife that serves multiple functions, tool, weapon, and symbol of his continued ability to take purposeful action in a world that seems to have lost all sense of purpose. The care of children requires improvised rituals that attempt to maintain some semblance of normalcy in circumstances that are anything but normal. Storytime in the underground chambers involves tales carefully edited to remove references to the outside world's current state, creating narrative islands where heroes still triumph and problems have solutions. The stories themselves become collaborative creations, with different adults contributing episodes that build elaborate fantasy worlds where the fundamental rules of existence are kinder than those currently governing their reality. Educational activities continue through informal networks of adults who feel compelled to ensure that children's intellectual development doesn't cease entirely. A former mathematics teacher conducts arithmetic lessons using practical problems, calculating water rations, dividing food supplies, estimating distances through the tunnel network. A retired librarian recites poetry from memory, creating literary experiences that exist purely in the realm of spoken word, unconnected to the physical books that may no longer exist anywhere in the city. The treatment of illness, injury, becomes a community responsibility that operates through carefully developed protocols. When someone falls sick, their care becomes a shared burden distributed according to each person's abilities and resources. The preparation of whatever herbal remedies can be created from scavenged materials becomes a collaborative effort that draws on the accumulated wisdom of multiple generations. Grandmothers' remedies, passing to daughters and daughters-in-law who never expected to need such knowledge. Religious observances adapt to circumstances that make traditional worship impossible. Prayer becomes a whispered activity conducted in corners and crevices, often wordless expressions of hope or gratitude that require no organized structure. The marking of significant dates in the religious calendar depends on individuals' memories rather than visible reminders, creating observances that are purely internal, yet no less meaningful for their privacy. The disposal of waste and the maintenance of sanitation become group activities that require careful planning and execution. The absence of functioning sewer systems means that human waste must be managed through systems that would have seemed primitive to these same people just months earlier. The psychological challenge of maintaining dignity while performing such basic functions creates additional stress layers that must be navigated alongside all the other degradations of their current existence. Communication with family members who might be elsewhere in the city or in other parts of Germany becomes an obsessive focus that drives many of the decisions about when and how to venture above ground. The checking of locations where messages might be left, the careful questioning of newcomers who might carry news from other districts, the maintenance of improvised postal systems that operate through networks of survivors. All of these activities provide structure to days that might otherwise be consumed entirely by the immediate requirement of staying alive. The preservation of memory becomes a conscious activity rather than something that happens automatically. People make deliberate efforts to remember what their neighborhoods looked like before the bombing, what their homes contained, and what their daily routines involve when such routines were choices rather than desperate improvisations. These memories are shared in evening conversations that serve the dual purpose of maintaining mental connections to better times while also preserving historical information for whatever future might eventually emerge from this chaos. Trade negotiations follow, elaborate social protocols that have evolved to prevent conflicts that could threaten the delicate balance. Maintaining group survival. The exchange of goods involves careful attention to perceived fairness, with community elders often serving as informal arbiters when disputes arise. These negotiations become social events that provide entertainment and human connection alongside their practical functions, creating opportunities for relationship building that help maintain the social fabric, preventing complete dissolution into individual survival efforts. As April 1945 draws toward its climax, the great symbols of power that once defined Berlin begin their final transformation from monuments of authority into battlegrounds where history writes its most definitive sentences. The Reichstag building, that massive stone embodiment of German political aspiration, stands like a wounded giant against the smoke-filled sky. Its neoclassical columns and elaborate facade bring the scars of artillery strikes and small arms fire. From your position in the underground network, the sounds of this final battle reach you as a complex symphony of destruction. The sharp crack of rifle fire punctuated by the deeper percussion of tank cannons, all underscored by the constant rumble of heavy machinery moving through streets that were never designed to accommodate the instruments of war. The building itself has become a fortress not through any deliberate design, but through the desperate improvisation that characterizes these final days of the Reich. What was once the seat of parliamentary democracy, then the symbol of Nazi authority, has now been transformed into something resembling a medieval castle. Under siege, its windows blocked with furniture and debris, its corridors converted into defensive positions, where exhausted soldiers wait for an enemy they know is coming but cannot predict when or from which direction. The irony of German troops defending a building that Hitler himself had used as a prop in his rise to power is lost on most of the participants, who are concerned not with political symbolism, but with the more immediate question of whether they will survive the next hour. The Soviet forces approaching this symbolic target represent the culmination of a military campaign that has crossed thousands of miles and consumed millions of lives. These are not fresh troops equipped with pristine weapons and unlimited supplies, but rather the survivors of a grinding advance through Poland and Eastern Germany. Soldiers who have seen their own cities destroyed and their families displaced, carrying with them not just military objectives, but personal motivations that add intensity to their assault on this particular building. Their approach through the devastated streets of central Berlin involves careful coordination between tank units and infantry, a deadly ballet performed among the rubble of what was once one of Europe's most magnificent cities. The actual fighting for the Reichstag unfolds over several days in late April, each day bringing the attackers closer to their symbolic prize, while the defenders adapt their tactics to an environment that changes hour by hour as walls are blown apart, staircases collapse, and rooms become impassable due to debris or fire. The combat moves through the building floor by floor, room by room, in a grinding process that reduces grand legislative chambers to collections of broken stone and splintered wood. What was once the gallery where visitors observed parliamentary debates becomes a sniper's nest. Speaker's podium, from which historic speeches were delivered, becomes cover for machine gun positions. The sounds of this battle create their own unique acoustic signature that distinguishes it from the general background of urban warfare. The echo of gunfire within the stone chambers amplifies and distorts in ways that make it difficult for participants to determine the exact location of threats. Voices, calling orders, or warnings bounce off marble surfaces and high ceilings, creating confusion that makes coordination between units challenging even under the best circumstances. The crash of falling masonry adds percussion to this deadly symphony. Each collapse potentially changing the tactical situation as new obstacles appear and existing defensive positions become untenable. The human cost of this symbolic battle accumulates in ways that military reports cannot adequately capture. Young German soldiers, many of them conscripted in the final desperate months of the war, find themselves defending a position that has no strategic value beyond its meaning as a symbol. Their training, often abbreviated due to the collapsing military situation, proves inadequate for this kind of close-quarters urban combat among ruins. Many of them have never seen combat before these final weeks, and their inexperience shows in the hesitant way they handle weapons, the uncertainty in their movements through the building, the visible fear in their eyes as they wait for orders from officers who may themselves be equally inexperienced. The Soviet assault troops, by contrast, bring with them the accumulated experience of years of combat. But this experience comes at its own psychological cost. These are soldiers who have seen too much death, who have participated in too many battles to maintain any illusions about war's glory or nobility. Their approach to taking the building is methodical rather than heroic, based on hard-won knowledge of how to clear rooms efficiently, how to minimize their own casualties while maximizing the pressure on defenders, how to coordinate multiple units in complex urban terrain without losing operational coherence. The physical environment of the battle changes constantly as explosive forces reshape the building's interior architecture. Grand staircases, designed to impress visitors with their sweeping curves, become rubble-filled obstacles that must be bypassed or cleared. Elegant chambers with high ceilings and ornate decorations transform into deadly killing fields where any movement draws immediate fire. The building's heating system, damaged by explosions, creates additional hazards as broken steam pipes fill rooms with scalding vapor, while severed electrical lines spark and create fire hazards among the debris. Medical care for the wounded becomes a logistical nightmare in this environment. German military medics, working with severely limited supplies, must treat injuries in locations that offer no protection from ongoing combat. The wounded cannot be easily evacuated due to the building's contested state, so treatment often consists of basic first aid applied under fire, with the understanding that more seriously injured soldiers may not survive long enough to receive definitive medical care. The screams and moans of the wounded add another layer to the battle's soundscape, reminder of war's human cost that penetrates even the most hardened soldiers. Psychological defenses, communication between different parts of the building becomes increasingly difficult as telephone lines are cut and radio equipment is damaged or destroyed. Orders must be carried by runners who face the deadly prospect of moving through contested corridors where any wrong turn might lead into enemy positions. This breakdown in command and control means that individual units often operate independently, making tactical decisions based on their immediate circumstances rather than any larger strategic plan. The result is combat that becomes increasingly chaotic and unpredictable. As the battle progresses, the weather during these final days adds its own misery to the fighting. Cold April rain turns the dust from pulverized masonry into mud that makes footing treacherous and reduces visibility in already dark interior spaces. The lack of functioning heating systems means that soldiers on both sides must deal with combat stress while also managing the physical discomfort of cold and dampness. Weapons become harder to maintain and operate reliably in these conditions, adding another variable to tactical calculations that are already complex beyond most participants' ability to fully process. The psychological warfare aspect of this battle involves both sides attempting to demoralize their opponents through displays of determination and inevitability. Soviet forces use loudspeakers to broadcast surrender demands and promises of fair treatment for those who give up, while German defenders respond with sniper fire and the occasional propaganda broadcast of their own. These competing narratives create an additional layer of stress for soldiers who must function effectively while being constantly reminded of the larger political and ideological stakes involved in their immediate tactical decisions. As the battle progresses and Soviet forces gain control of more of the building, the symbolic significance of each room's capture becomes more apparent. The chamber where the German parliament once met becomes a particularly contested prize, not because of any tactical advantage it offers, but because of its obvious propaganda value to the victors. The fight for this single room involves hand-to-hand combat among the overturned furniture and debris-covered floor where democratic debate once occurred. A transformation so complete that the room's original purpose becomes almost unimaginable. In the deepest bunkers beneath the Reich Chancellery, time moves differently than it does in the world above, where the battle for the Reichstag rages and civilians huddle in their underground refuges. Here, in chambers designed to protect the Nazi leadership from the consequences of their own decisions, the final act of the Third Reich plays out in an atmosphere of surreal detachment from the reality unfolding just meters above their heads. The bunker complex, with its reinforced concrete walls and filtered air systems, creates an environment that is simultaneously the most secure location in Berlin and the most psychologically claustrophobic, sealed world where the architects of destruction must finally confront the magnitude of what they have created. The air in these underground chambers carries a quality that seems almost sepulchral, thick with the exhaled breath of people who have been sealed away from natural ventilation for weeks. The constant hum of generators and air filtration systems creates a background drone that becomes part of the environment, a mechanical heartbeat that reminds everyone present that their survival depends entirely on machinery that could fail at any moment. The lighting, provided by harsh electric bulbs that never dim, creates a timeless quality where day and night lose their meaning, where the natural rhythms that normally regulate human existence become irrelevant to the strange reality of this artificial world. The rooms themselves represent the ultimate expression of German engineering efficiency. Every space carefully planned to serve specific functions during what was intended to be a temporary refuge from enemy bombing. The conference room, with its large table and detailed maps, continues to host meetings where tactical decisions are discussed as though they might still influence outcomes that have already been determined by forces far beyond the control of the bunker's inhabitants. The maps themselves, marked with colored pins and drawn boundaries, represent a fantasy version of the military situation, dated by staff members who receive information filtered through so many layers of wishful thinking that it bears little resemblance to the actual state of German defenses. The daily routines that govern life in this underground fortress maintain an elaborate pretense of normalcy that becomes increasingly absurd as reports from the outside world make clear the hopelessness of the situation. Meals are served at regular intervals, prepared in kitchens that are better supplied than any restaurant in Berlin, using ingredients that represent a grotesque abundance while the city above starves. The contrast between this underground plenty and the desperate scarcity experienced by ordinary Berliners creates a moral divide so extreme that it seems to exist in a different universe entirely. The psychological dynamics among the bunkers' cadence create tensions that are all the more intense for being confined within such a small space. The rigid hierarchies that once governed the Nazi state continue to operate even as the state itself disintegrates, creating situations where people maintain elaborate ceremonies of deference and protocol while discussing the collapse of everything. These ceremonies were designed to support secretaries continue to type orders that will never be implemented. Communications officers relay messages to units that may no longer exist. And military advisors present strategic analysis of situations that have moved far beyond any possibility of strategic influence. The communication systems that connect the bunker to the outside world provide a steady stream of information that becomes increasingly disconnected from reality as the sources of that information are destroyed or overrun by advancing enemy forces. Radio reports arrive describing successful counterattacks and strategic withdrawals that everyone in the bunker knows represent desperate last stands and chaotic retreats. The gap between official reports and actual conditions becomes so extreme that maintaining the pretense of believing the reports requires a collective suspension of disbelief that adds its own layer of psychological stress to an already unbearable situation. Sleep in the bunker comes fitfully interrupted by the vibrations that penetrate even the thick concrete walls when particularly large explosions occur in the city above. The beds, comfortable by wartime standards, cannot provide rest when the occupants are constantly aware that their sanctuary could become their tomb if the battle above ground shifts in certain directions. Dreams, when they come, often involve the world above, memories of Berlin when it was beautiful, fantasies of escape to places beyond the reach of the war they helped create, nightmares that blend current reality with imagined futures too terrible to contemplate while awake. The medical facilities in the bunker, staffed by doctors who once served the Nazi elite, now face the unique challenge of treating patients whose ailments are largely psychological rather than physical. The stress of confinement, combined with the knowledge of what awaits should they be captured, creates symptoms that no amount of medical training can adequately address. Pills are distributed to help with sleep, but sleep brings dreams that are often worse than waking thoughts. Sedatives are available for those whose psychological state threatens to disturb the carefully maintained atmosphere of controlled normalcy. But the chemical calm they provide only postpones, rather than resolves, the underlying psychological crisis. The children present in the bunker family members of high-ranking officials exist in a particularly surreal situation, protected from immediate physical danger, but exposed to psychological stresses that no child should have to experience. They play games in corridors that echo with adult conversations about suicide and surrender, their laughter creating a sound so incongruous in this environment that it becomes almost frightening. Their parents attempt to maintain normal routines of childcare while simultaneously preparing for outcomes that they cannot discuss openly, but which color every interaction with desperate intensity. The religious services held in the bunker take on characteristics that blend Christian tradition with the peculiar theological challenges presented by their current circumstances. Prayers for victory become increasingly perfunctory as it becomes clear that divine intervention, if it comes at all, is unlikely to favor their cause. The chaplains who conduct these services face the nearly impossible task of providing spiritual comfort to people who must confront not only their own mortality, but their responsibility for measurable suffering inflicted on others. The destruction of documents becomes a constant activity as staff members burn papers that could provide evidence of war crimes if they fall into enemy hands. The smoke from these fires adds to the bunker's oppressive atmosphere, while the act of destroying records creates an additional psychological burden for people who must systematically erase the evidence of their own participation in historical events. The flames that consume these documents represent not just the destruction of evidence, but the erasure of entire careers, entire belief systems, entire ways of understanding the world and Germany's place in it. Food, preparation, and consumption in the bunker maintains an elaborate formality that serves as a psychological anchor in a world where all other certainties have dissolved. The dining rituals, with their careful attention to protocol and precedence, provide a framework for human interaction that allows the bunker's inhabitants to avoid direct confrontation with their situation. Conversations during meals follow carefully established patterns that permit discussion of technical military matters while avoiding any direct acknowledgement of the larger implications of their circumstances. The bunker's ventilation systems, designed to protect against chemical weapons, cannot filter out the psychological toxins that accumulate when people who have exercised absolute power must confront the absolute nature of their failure. The air becomes thick, not just with mechanical recycling, but with the emotional residue of conversations that can never quite say what everyone knows to be true, that the world they created is ending, that the consequences of their actions are finally arriving, that the protective walls around them represent not sanctuary, but a kind of elaborate tomb. The telephone systems that once connected these underground chambers to the entire apparatus of Nazi governance now carry increasingly desperate messages from subordinates seeking orders that their superiors can no longer meaningfully provide. The conversations become shorter and more stilted as both parties recognize that the normal chains of command have become meaningless when the commands themselves cannot be executed. The silence that follows each disconnected call becomes heavier than the conversations that preceded it. Personal hygiene and grooming continue with an attention to detail that seems almost obsessive under the circumstances, still maintaining physical appearances can somehow maintain psychological stability in the face of overwhelming evidence that their world is ending. The mirrors in the bunker's bathrooms reflect faces that show the strain of their situation, despite every effort to maintain composure. Eyes that cannot quite hide the knowledge of what they have done and what awaits them as consequences for their actions. The mechanical systems that maintain life support in the bunker require constant attention from technicians who understand that any failure could transform this refuge into a death trap. The generators that provide electricity, the pumps that circulate air, filters that remove contaminants, all of these require fuel and maintenance that become increasingly difficult to obtain as the battle above ground cuts supply lines and destroys infrastructure. The sound of machinery running smoothly provides psychological comfort, while any irregularity in mechanical operation creates anxiety that spreads through the bunker's population like a contagious disease. As the final days of April 1945 unfold, key carefully maintained veneer of civilization that has held Berlin together throughout the war years finally begins to crack in ways that become visible even to casual observers. The collapse manifests not in dramatic moments of violent revolution, but rather in the quiet erosion of countless small systems and agreements that normally operate below the level of conscious awareness. Traffic laws become meaningless when there are no functioning traffic lights and no police to enforce regulations. Store hours become irrelevant when there are no goods to sell and no customers with money to buy them. The postal system, that fundamental infrastructure of modern communication, simply ceases to exist as postal workers abandon their routes and sorting facilities are destroyed by bombing. In the government offices that still maintain some pretense of operation, civil servants arrive each morning to find that the problems they're supposed to solve have grown beyond any possibility of administrative solution. The bureaucracy that once regulated everything from building permits to marriage licenses continues to generate paperwork that documents a reality that no longer exists. Forms are filled out requesting supplies that cannot be obtained, reporting statistics about populations that have fled or perished, maintaining records of institutions that have been destroyed. The filing cabinets in these offices contain the fossilized remains of a system of social organization that became irrelevant so gradually that no one noticed the exact moment when it stopped functioning. The educational system collapses in stages that reflect the broader disintegration of social order. Schools close, not through official decree, but through the practical impossibility of maintaining them when teachers cannot reach classrooms, when heating fuel is unavailable, when children are needed to help their families survive rather than attend lessons. The few teachers who continue working do so in improvised settings, basement classrooms lit by candles, lessons conducted in subway tunnels between air raids, education reduced to its most basic elements of reading, writing, and arithmetic taught, with whatever materials can be scavenged from the ruins of proper schools. The medical system experiences its own form of collapse as hospitals run out of medicines. Surgical instruments become impossible to sterilize properly, and medical personnel are forced to make decisions about resource allocation that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. Doctors, trained to save lives, find themselves forced to determine which patients have realistic chances of survival and which should be made comfortable while they die. The Hippocratic Oath's promise to do no harm becomes meaningless when every treatment decision involves choosing between different forms of harm. Because when healing requires resources that don't exist, when the infrastructure necessary for modern medicine has been destroyed by forces beyond medical control, the transportation network that once moved people and goods efficiently throughout the city transforms into an obstacle course of destroyed bridges, bombed out subway tunnels, and streets blocked by rubble from collapsed buildings. The few vehicles still operational must navigate routes that change daily as new damage makes familiar paths impassable. Pedestrians develop an almost instinctive ability to assess which buildings might collapse, which streets might be targeted by artillery, which areas are safe for movement, and which should be avoided entirely. Walking from one part of the city to another becomes an expedition, requiring careful planning and considerable courage. The banking system, the fundamental institution of modern economic life, ceases to function in any meaningful way as bank. Buildings are destroyed, records are lost, and the currency itself becomes worthless. People who spent decades accumulating savings discover that their financial security exists only on paper that has no connection to any tangible reality. The elaborate credit systems that enable complex economic transactions simply evaporate, leaving behind a primitive barter economy where the only things of value are those that can be immediately consumed or used for survival. Religious institutions struggle to maintain their role as sources of spiritual comfort and community organization when their buildings are destroyed and their congregations are scattered. Clergy find themselves conducting funeral services for people whose bodies cannot be recovered. It's providing counseling for traumas that exceed any theological framework for understanding suffering. It's maintaining faith in divine benevolence while surrounded by evidence that suggests either divine absence or divine malevolence. The churches that remain standing become refuges, not just for worship, but for the most basic forms of human shelter and community support. The legal system, with its elaborate procedures for determining guilt and innocence, becomes irrelevant. When the crimes being committed are too massive for any court to address, and when the infrastructure for law enforcement has been destroyed, police stations are abandoned, courthouses are bombed, and the judges and lawyers who might staff a legal system are either dead, fled, or dealing with their own survival crises. Justice, in any formal sense, becomes impossible to obtain or administer, leaving communities to develop their own informal systems for resolving disputes and maintaining some semblance of social order. The utilities that provide the invisible infrastructure of modern life, electricity, gas, water, sewage treatment, fail one by one, as if physical systems are damaged beyond repair, and their maintenance staff are unable to perform the complex coordination necessary to keep them operational. The failure of these systems has cascading effects that multiply the difficulty of every aspect of daily life. Without electricity, food cannot be refrigerated. Communication becomes impossible. Space to be in the basic lighting that allows people to function after dark disappears. Without gas, cooking and heating become major challenges that require constant attention and resource allocation. The fire department, that essential service for any urban area, becomes unable to respond to fires effectively when water pressure systems fail, when roads are blocked by debris, and when the fires themselves are often caused by military action that continues even during firefighting efforts. Buildings burn for days without any attempt at suppression, flames adding to the smoke-filled atmosphere that characterizes the city during these final weeks. The fire department's emergency medical services similarly become unavailable, leaving accident and injury victims dependent on whatever informal medical care their families and neighbors can provide. The sanitation systems that remove waste and maintain public health collapse in ways that create additional health hazards for a population already struggling with malnutrition and exposure. Garbage accumulates in the streets, attracting rats and insects that carry diseases. Human waste cannot be processed through normal sewage systems, creating contamination risks that threaten the already inadequate water supplies. The bodies of those who die from war, injuries, disease, or starvation cannot be properly buried or cremated, leading to public health challenges that compound all the other difficulties facing the surviving population. The news media, which normally provides citizens with information necessary for democratic participation and personal decision-making, either ceases publication entirely or becomes a source of propaganda, so disconnected from reality that it provides no useful guidance for people trying to navigate their immediate circumstances. Radio broadcasts become increasingly rare and unreliable, while newspapers either stop printing entirely or publish fantasies about military victories that bear no resemblance to the evidence available to ordinary citizens experiencing the results of military defeat firsthand. The manufacturing sector that normally produces goods necessary for daily life converts entirely to war production or shuts down when raw materials become unavailable and workers are conscripted for military service or forced labor. The consumer goods that people need to maintain normal lives simply cease to be produced, while the industrial capacity that might produce them is either destroyed by bombing or repurposed for military needs that prove ultimately futile. The result is an economy that can no longer provide the material basis for the kind of civilization it was designed to support. The agricultural system that supplies food to urban populations becomes unable to function when farmers are conscripted for military service, when transportation networks cannot move crops from rural areas to cities, and when the industrial systems that produce fertilizers and farming equipment are destroyed or converted to war production. The result is food shortages that began as inconvenience but gradually become genuine threats to survival for urban populations that depend entirely on agricultural systems they cannot see or control. Professional services that normally provide expert assistance for complex problems become unavailable when the professionals themselves face the same survival challenges as everyone else. Lawyers cannot practice when courts don't function. Architects cannot design buildings when construction materials don't exist. Engineers cannot maintain infrastructure when the infrastructure itself has been systematically destroyed. The accumulated professional expertise that represents generations of specialized knowledge becomes irrelevant when the social systems that make such specialization possible no longer exist. The collapse extends even to the most basic forms of social organization, as families are separated by death, flight, or military conscription, leaving behind social fragments that must somehow reorganize themselves into new forms of mutual support. Children become separated from parents. Spouses lose contact with each other. And extended family networks that normally provide backup support systems are scattered across geographic areas where communication and travel have become extremely difficult. The result is a social atomization that makes every survival challenge more difficult because it must be faced by individuals or very small groups rather than by the larger social networks that normally distribute risks and resources across broader populations. In the quiet moments between air raids and artillery bombardments, when the immediate demands of survival allow for brief periods of reflection, some of Berlin's trapped civilians turn to one of humanity's oldest forms of psychological survival, the act of bearing witness through written words. These diaries, journals, and hastily scribbled notes represent more than mere historical documentation. They constitute a form of resistance against the erasure of individual experience. A way of asserting that personal humanity persists even when surrounded by forces that seem designed to eliminate the very possibility of individual dignity and meaning. The physical act of writing under these circumstances required a kind of stubborn determination that went far beyond simple record keeping. Paper became a precious commodity, often salvaged from damaged books or official documents that had lost their original purpose. Pencils and pens were hoarded like medicine, their remaining ink or graphite rationed to ensure that the most important thoughts could be preserved. Many writers developed abbreviated personal systems of notation, shorthand methods that could convey maximum meaning with minimum use of their precious writing materials. The locations where these private documents were created tell their own stories about the extremes to which ordinary people were pushed during Berlin's final weeks. Some diaries were written by candlelight in basement shelters, the writer's hand shaking from cold or fear while artillery shells exploded overhead. Others were composed in brief snatches during daylight hours when the author could find a relatively quiet corner in a bombed-out building, always with one ear listening for the sounds that might indicate immediate danger approaching. The temporal structure of these writings reflects the disorientation that characterized the civilian experience during this period. Traditional markers of time, regular meals, work schedules, social appointments had become meaningless, replaced by rhythms dictated by military action and survival necessity. Writers often noted their confusion about what day of the week it was, or even what date, as the normal frameworks for organizing time dissolved under the pressure of events too large and traumatic for ordinary consciousness to fully process. Entries from early April reveal writers still clinging to the belief that their situation, however desperate, represents a temporary crisis that will eventually resolve into something resembling normal life. These early passages often focus on practical concerns: where to find food, how to keep warm, which routes through the city remain passable. The tone is often matter-of-fact, almost businesslike, as though the writers believe that systematic attention to detail will somehow restore order to their chaotic circumstances as the month progresses and the situation continues to deteriorate. The diary entries begin to reflect a psychological shift from problem-solving to witness-bearing. Writers begin to document not just their own experiences, but the behavior of their neighbors, the condition of their neighborhoods, the small acts of kindness and cruelty that reveal how extreme circumstances bring out both the best and worst aspects of human nature. These observations often carry a quality of anthropological fascination, as though the writers have become ethnographies studying the breakdown of their own civilization. The language used in these private documents evolves as writers struggle to find words adequate to describe experiences that exceed normal vocabulary. Traditional terms like difficult or challenging prove inadequate for circumstances that threaten the basic possibility of survival. Writers develop their own personal lexicons, creating phrases and descriptions that capture the specific quality of their unprecedented situation. The inadequacy of normal language becomes a recurring theme, with many entries noting the impossibility of conveying the full reality of their experience to anyone who hasn't lived through it. Children's voices appear in some of these documents, either through their own attempts at writing or through adult transcription of their observations and questions. These young perspectives often reveal details that adult writers overlook, focused as they are on immediate survival concerns. A child might note the way sunlight looks different when filtered through smoke and dust, or observe how adults' behavior has changed in ways that the adults themselves might not recognize. These childhood perspectives provide a unique window into how extreme circumstances affect developing minds that haven't yet learned to filter experience through adult assumptions about normalcy. The religious content of these writings varies dramatically based on the writer's backgrounds and personal beliefs, but almost all grapple in some way with questions of meaning and purpose that extreme suffering inevitably raises. Some find comfort in traditional prayers and biblical passages, copying familiar texts that provide psychological anchor points in circumstances that seem to have no precedent in their personal experience. Others wrestle with theological questions about divine justice and the problem of innocent suffering, using their private writing as a space to explore doubts and fears that they cannot voice aloud. Many entries document the small rituals and routines that writers developed to maintain some sense of personal agency and dignity in circumstances largely beyond their control. The careful description of how to make coffee from acorns becomes a way of asserting that civilized behavior can persist even in uncivilized circumstances. The detailed account of mending clothes with improvised materials represents more than practical information. It constitutes evidence that human beings can maintain their essential humanity even when reduced to the most basic survival concerns. Social dynamics described in these private writings reveal how extreme circumstances create both extraordinary bonds and terrible conflicts among people who find themselves dependent on each other for survival. Writers document acts of surprising generosity, people sharing their last bit of food with strangers, risking their own safety to help injured neighbors, maintaining optimism and humor in circumstances that seem to allow for nothing but despair. They also record instances of selfishness, cruelty, and moral compromise that reveal how quickly civilized behavior can deteriorate when the normal social structures that support it are removed. Dreams and nightmares feature prominently in many of these private accounts, with writers using their journals to process psychological content that their waking minds struggle to integrate. The dream narratives often blend memories of peacetime life with current traumatic experiences, creating surreal mental landscapes where familiar people appear in impossible situations, where normal activities continue despite apocalyptic surroundings. The act of recording these dreams seems to provide a form of psychological release, a way of acknowledging the full impact of their experiences on their mental and emotional well-being. Letters to family members, who may or may not still be alive, constitute another form of private writing that appears frequently during this period. These communications, often written with no realistic prospect of delivery, serve multiple psychological functions. They provide a way for writers to maintain connection with their former identities as family members, friends, and participants in social networks that may no longer exist. They also offer a format for expressing emotions and concerns that might be too overwhelming to confront directly, allowing writers to address their fears and hopes to specific imagined audiences rather than confronting them in isolation. The physical deterioration of the city appears in these writings not just as background information, but as a character in its own right, with writers documenting how the destruction of familiar landmarks affects their sense of personal identity and belonging. The obliteration of the neighborhood church, the collapse of the school where the writer once studied. The transformation of familiar streets into obstacle courses of rubble. These changes represent more than mere physical damage. They constitute the erasure of the environmental framework within which the writers understood themselves and their place in the world. Food becomes a recurring obsession in these private writings, not merely as a practical concern, but as a symbol of everything that has been lost and everything that might someday be recovered. Writers provide detailed descriptions of meals they remember from better times, elaborate fantasies about foods they hope to eat again when the crisis passes, and careful documentation of the creative ways they've learned to prepare nutrition from whatever materials they can obtain. These food narratives often carry an almost mystical quality, as though the act of writing about proper meals can somehow conjure the possibility of their eventual return. The documentation of death and loss in these private writings takes forms that reveal how individuals cope with trauma that exceeds their capacity for normal emotional processing. Some writers provide clinical, almost medical descriptions of injuries and deaths they've witnessed. Takes language that seems designed to create psychological distance from events too painful to confront directly. Others develop elaborate memorial practices in their writing, creating detailed written portraits of people who have died that serve as private monuments to lives that might otherwise be forgotten entirely. Weather appears in these accounts not merely as atmospheric description, but as a factor that significantly influences practical survival and psychological well-being. Cold rain that turns rubble-filled streets into impassable mud becomes more than an inconvenience. It represents an additional enemy that must be fought alongside all the human adversaries threatening survival. Rare moments of sunshine take on significance far beyond their meteorological impact, becoming symbols of hope and continuity that remind writers of the natural world that continues to exist beyond the human-created catastrophes surrounding them. Evolution of these private writings over time reveals psychological adaptation processes that operate below the level of conscious awareness. Early entries often express shock and disbelief at the extremity of circumstances, while later passages demonstrate the writer's gradual development of new frameworks for understanding and coping with their situation. This adaptation process, documented in real time through private writing, provides insight into human psychological resilience that might not be accessible through any other form of historical evidence. Beneath the visible surface of destruction and chaos that characterized Berlin during its final weeks, is an intricate and largely invisible network of mutual aid and resource sharing developed among the civilian population. This underground economy of survival operated according to rules that were never written down, but were understood implicitly by those who participated in it. The network functioned through a combination of pre-existing social relationships, newly formed alliances based on practical necessity, and an elaborate system of trust and reciprocity that enabled people to share resources and information despite the constant threat of betrayal or exploitation. The foundation of this survival network rested on the recognition that individual families, no matter how resourceful or well prepared, could not possibly obtain all the materials and information necessary for survival through their own efforts alone. A family might have access to a source of clean water, but lack any means of obtaining food. Another household might have managed to accumulate a small store of preserved foods, but have no way to cook them safely. A third group might possess valuable information about which streets remained passable or which buildings still contained useful supplies, but lacked the physical strength necessary to retrieve those supplies themselves. The exchange of information constituted perhaps the most crucial currency in this informal economy. Knowledge about which areas of the city had been occupied by Soviet forces, which buildings still had functioning cellars suitable for shelter, which routes through the rubble provided the safest passage between different neighborhoods. This kind of intelligence often meant the difference between survival and death. The networks that developed to share such information operated through chains of personal relationships that could extend across significant distances within the city, allowing news to travel from one district to another. Despite the breakdown of all official communication systems, women often emerged as the primary architects and operators of these survival networks, partly because their traditional roles as household managers had provided them with skills directly applicable to resource allocation and social coordination, and partly because they were less likely than men to be conscripted for military service or forced labor. These women developed sophisticated systems for tracking which families had particular needs, which households possessed surplus resources that might be available for trade, and which individuals could be trusted to honor agreements made under circumstances where there was no legal enforcement mechanism available. The development of trust relationships within these networks required careful evaluation of character and reliability under conditions where making the wrong assessment could have fatal consequences. People learned to read subtle signals in behavior, speech patterns, and decision-making that indicated whether a potential trading partner was likely to honor agreements, maintain confidentiality about resource locations, and resist the temptation to exploit others' vulnerabilities for personal advantage. These evaluation skills had to be developed quickly, often based on very limited contact, since the circumstances didn't allow for the gradual relationship building that normally precedes significant trust relationships. Children played unique roles within these survival networks, often serving as messengers who could move through the city with less suspicion than adults might attract. Their small size allowed them to navigate through damaged buildings and blocked passages that would be impassable for grown-ups, while their apparent innocence made them less likely to be stopped and questioned by authorities who might be suspicious of adult movement. Many children developed remarkable skill at memorizing complex verbal messages and carrying them accurately across significant distances, becoming living communication links between separated parts of the network. The physical locations where network exchanges took place were carefully chosen to minimize the risk of detection while maximizing accessibility for participants who might be weakened by malnutrition or recovering from injuries. Certain basement areas, partially collapsed buildings with multiple exit routes, and underground passages connecting different cellars became informal meeting points where people could conduct business with some degree of privacy and security. These locations were often marked by subtle signals, a particular arrangement of debris, specific graffiti marks, or other indicators that would be meaningful to network participants but invisible to outsiders. Barter ratios within this survival economy fluctuated based on supply and availability in ways that created a complex pricing system despite the absence of any standard currency. A single can of preserved meat might trade for several kilograms of coal when heating fuel was desperately needed, but the same can might be worth only a small amount of flour when protein was abundant, but bread-making materials were scarce. Participants in these networks developed an intuitive understanding of these value fluctuations and learned to time their trades to maximize the benefit they could obtain from whatever resources they possessed. The moral and ethical challenges created by participation in these survival networks required individuals to make decisions that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. When resources were insufficient to meet everyone's needs, participants had to decide how to allocate limited supplies among competing claims. Should a family's last bit of medicine go to their own sick child or to a neighbor's child who might have a better chance of recovery? Should information about a hidden food cache be shared with the broader network or kept secret to ensure one's own family's survival? These decisions created psychological burdens that many participants carried long after the immediate crisis had passed. Medical care within these networks operated through a combination of formal medical knowledge possessed by trained professionals and folk remedies passed down through generations of family tradition. Former nurses, doctors, and medical students provided whatever professional care was possible with extremely limited supplies. while older women contributed knowledge of herbal treatments and traditional healing practices that could be implemented using materials available in the urban environment. The integration of these different forms of medical knowledge created treatment approaches that blended scientific understanding with practical improvisation. The networks developed sophisticated systems for protecting vulnerable members, elderly, individuals who could no longer contribute labor, children who had been separated from their families, and injured or sick people who required care but couldn't reciprocate immediately. These protection systems operated on principles of enlightened self-interest as well as altruism, since network members understood that they might someday find themselves in similar positions of vulnerability. The care provided to helpless individuals served as a form of insurance that created expectations of similar care should circumstances change. Information about the broader military and political situation filtered through these networks in ways that often provided more accurate assessments than official propaganda sources. Network participants who had contact with refugees from other parts of Germany, or who had encounters with military personnel, shared intelligence that allowed civilians to make informed decisions about whether to attempt escape, which directions might offer better prospects for survival, and what they could expect from occupying forces when those forces arrived. This intelligence network often operated more effectively than official military communications that were disrupted by combat conditions. The psychological support functions of these survival networks proved as important as their material resource sharing capabilities. Regular contact with network participants provided social interaction that helped prevent the complete isolation that could lead to psychological breakdown. The act of helping others, even in small ways, allowed people to maintain some sense of purpose and agency in circumstances that otherwise made them feel completely powerless. The shared experience of participating in mutual aid created bonds among strangers that sometimes proved more durable than many peacetime friendships. Security measures within these networks required constant vigilance against infiltration by hostile forces who might exploit the network's resources for their own benefit or use information about network operations to harm participants. Network organizers developed subtle testing procedures for evaluating new participants, codes for communicating sensitive information, and emergency procedures for protecting network assets if hostile penetration was discovered. These security measures had to balance the need for protection against the equally important need for network expansion that could increase everyone's survival chances. The documentation and record-keeping practices in these networks were necessarily minimal and often conducted through verbal communication rather than written records that could provide evidence of network activities if discovered by hostile authorities. Important information was often memorized by multiple individuals to ensure preservation even if some network members were lost. While complex agreements were simplified into forms that could be remembered accurately without written documentation, this reliance on human memory for network operations created both vulnerabilities and strengths that distinguished survival networks from more formal organizational structures. Seasonal variations in resource availability and survival challenges required network operations to adapt constantly to changing conditions. Winter's approach meant increased emphasis on fuel and warm clothing, while spring brought possibilities for scavenging wild foods and materials from damaged gardens and parks. Network organizers developed sophisticated understanding of these seasonal cycles and planned resource allocation strategies that took advantage of predictable variations in supply and demand patterns. In the midst of Berlin's collapse, an entirely new vocabulary emerged among the civilian population, words and phrases that captured experiences for which the German language had previously provided no adequate expression. This linguistic evolution reflected not merely practical adaptation to changed circumstances, but a deeper psychological process through which people struggled to maintain meaning and communication in a world where familiar reference points had been destroyed or transformed beyond recognition. The development of this crisis vocabulary reveals how human consciousness adapts to extreme circumstances by creating new, conceptual frameworks that make it possible to think and speak about previously unimaginable realities. The word normal underwent a complete transformation in meaning during these final weeks of the war. What had once referred to peacetime routines and expectations now became a flexible concept that described whatever degree of stability could be achieved under current conditions. A normal day might be one where no artillery shells landed in the immediate neighborhood, where the water supply functioned for several hours, where nobody in the household died from injury or illness. This redefinition of normalcy served crucial psychological functions, allowing people to maintain some sense of progress and achievement even when their circumstances remained objectively desperate. Time-related vocabulary developed new layers of meaning that reflected the disruption of conventional temporal frameworks. Yesterday might refer not to the previous calendar day, but to the last time the speaker felt safe, while tomorrow could mean either the next 24 hours or some indefinite future when the current crisis would end. The phrase "before the war" came to represent not just a specific historical period, but an entirely different mode of existence. A lost world of abundance and security that seemed as distant as a fairy tale, despite having ended only months or years earlier. Euphemisms proliferated as people struggled to discuss traumatic experiences without confronting their full psychological impact directly. Death became going away or not being with us anymore, while severe injuries were described as having difficulties or not feeling well. These linguistic strategies served protective functions, allowing essential information to be communicated, while providing emotional buffer between speakers and the harsh realities they needed to acknowledge without being overwhelmed by them. The use of such euphemisms became so habitual that many people found themselves able to use direct language even in private thoughts. The vocabulary of hunger developed extraordinary sophistication as malnutrition became a universal experience. That required precise communication about degrees and types of nutritional deprivation. People learned to distinguish between different qualities of emptiness, the sharp pain of acute hunger versus the dull ache of chronic malnourishment, the weakness that comes from lack of calories versus the specific deficiencies that result from absence of particular nutrients. This expanded hunger vocabulary allowed for more effective resource sharing and mutual aid, since people could communicate their needs and capabilities with greater precision. Place names within the city acquired new meanings that reflected the radical transformation of familiar locations. The street where someone had lived for decades might be referred to by descriptions of its current state rather than its official name. The street with the big crater, or where the pharmacy used to be. These descriptive place names served both practical navigation functions and psychological purposes, allowing people to acknowledge the destruction of familiar environments while maintaining some continuity with their previous relationship to those spaces. The language used to describe relationships between people evolved to accommodate the breakdown of traditional social structures and the formation of new survival-based alliances. Terms like family expanded to include individuals who had no blood relationship but who shared resources and responsibilities for mutual survival. Neighbor might refer to anyone within walking distance with whom one had established trust relationships, regardless of their actual residential proximity. These linguistic adaptations reflected real changes in social organization while helping to maintain the human need for belonging and connection. Religious and spiritual vocabulary underwent significant adaptation as people struggled to maintain faith frameworks in circumstances that challenged traditional theological explanations. Prayer language became more direct and practical, focusing on immediate survival needs rather than abstract spiritual concerns. Many people developed private spiritual vocabularies that blended traditional religious concepts with more pragmatic approaches to meaning-making that could accommodate the reality of apparently senseless suffering and destruction. The description of physical spaces required new architectural vocabulary that could capture the reality of buildings that were partially destroyed but still partially functional. Terms emerged to describe the various stages of structural damage. Buildings that were mostly there versus those that were mostly not there. Spaces that provided real shelter versus those that offered only better than nothing protection from weather and debris. This specialized vocabulary allowed for efficient communication about housing options and safety. Assessments. Color terminology expanded to capture the visual reality of a city, where traditional chromatic categories had been replaced by an entirely new palette dominated by variations of gray, brown, and black. People developed precise language for describing different types of smoke: the dark smoke from burning buildings, the lighter smoke from cooking fires, the acrid smoke from chemical materials. The color of dust became a diagnostic tool for determining the source and danger level of debris clouds that might indicate nearby explosions or structural collapses. Sound vocabulary became remarkably sophisticated as people learned to interpret the acoustic landscape of urban warfare. Different types of explosions required different behavioral responses, and the language that developed to describe these sounds allowed for rapid communication about immediate threats: the whistle of incoming artillery shells, the crack of sniper fire, the rumble of tank engines. Each sound category developed its instinct. I just know it's going to be a really good day because I just know it's going to start out by going to Starbucks. Own descriptive language that enabled efficient threat assessment and response, coordination among civilian populations. Medical vocabulary adapted to accommodate the reality that professional medical care was largely unavailable, and that people needed to communicate about health problems using terms that non-medical individuals could understand and act upon. Traditional medical terminology was supplemented with descriptive language that could convey essential diagnostic information without requiring formal medical training. This democratization of medical vocabulary allowed communities to provide better mutual care while acknowledging the limitations of their medical knowledge and resources. The language used to describe hope and fear evolved to capture psychological states that had no precedent in peacetime experience. Hope became more concrete and immediate, focused on specific short-term objectives rather than abstract future possibilities. Fear vocabulary became more nuanced, distinguishing between rational concerns based on observable threats and anxiety that might interfere with necessary survival activities. This psychological vocabulary helped people maintain mental health by providing frameworks for understanding and managing their emotional responses to extreme circumstances. Food-related language developed extraordinary richness as people became connoisseurs of scarcity, developing precise terminology for different degrees of edibility and nutritional value. Terms emerged to describe food that was still safe to eat despite significant deterioration. Methods for improving the palatability of barely edible materials, and techniques for extracting maximum nutritional value from minimal ingredients. This culinary vocabulary of desperation represented both practical knowledge sharing and a form of cultural preservation that maintained human dignity through attention to the civilized activity of food preparation. The vocabulary of memory became particularly important as people struggled to preserve connections to their former lives while adapting to radically changed circumstances. Language emerged to describe different types of remembering memories that provided comfort versus those that caused pain, memories that remained vivid versus those that seemed to be fading, memories that felt real versus those that seemed like they might belong to someone else's life. This memory vocabulary helped people process traumatic experiences while maintaining psychological continuity with their previous identities. Communication about the future required entirely new linguistic frameworks, since traditional planning vocabulary assumed levels of stability and predictability that no longer existed. People developed language for discussing possibilities rather than plans, preferences rather than decisions, hopes rather than expectations. This future-oriented vocabulary acknowledged uncertainty while maintaining the human need to anticipate and prepare for whatever might come next. The language used to describe moral and ethical decisions evolved to accommodate situations where traditional moral frameworks provided inadequate guidance. New vocabulary emerged to describe the ethical complexity of survival decisions, terms that could capture the difference between choices made from selfishness versus those made from desperate necessity, actions that violated peacetime moral standards but served essential survival functions. This ethical vocabulary helped people maintain some sense of moral agency while acknowledging that extreme circumstances sometimes required morally ambiguous choices. Deep beneath the ruined streets of Berlin, in chambers that seemed to exist in a different universe entirely from the desperate struggle for survival taking place just meters above, the final rituals of Nazi power play out with a surreal attention to protocol and ceremony that becomes more grotesque with each passing hour. The bunker's dining facilities, designed to maintain the elaborate meal customs that had characterized Nazi elite social life, continue to operate with an efficiency that stands in stark contrast to the chaos consuming the city above ground. The contrast between the abundance available in these underground chambers and the starvation experienced by Berlin's civilian population creates a moral chasm so extreme that it seems to represent the ultimate expression of the regime's fundamental indifference to human suffering. The preparation of meals in the bunker kitchen requires no compromise with wartime shortages or rationing restrictions. The pantries remain stocked with delicacies that have been unavailable to ordinary Germans for years: real coffee, fresh meat, white bread, chocolate, wine, spirits that represent a level of luxury that most of the city's population can barely remember. The kitchen staff is composed of individuals who have been carefully selected for both their culinary skills and their political reliability, continue to prepare elaborate multi-course meals with the same attention to presentation and flavor that characterized peacetime entertaining among the Nazi elite. The dining room itself maintains an atmosphere of formal elegance that seems to exist in deliberate denial of the reality surrounding it. The table is set with fine china and crystal, silverware polished to gleaming perfection, linen napkins folded according to protocols that were established when the regime still believed in its own permanence. Candles provide illumination that creates a warm, intimate atmosphere, while the mechanical ventilation systems ensure that no hint of the smoke and destruction from above penetrates into this artificially preserved environment. The conversations during these meals follow patterns established over years of Nazi social gatherings, but the content has acquired an increasingly surreal quality as the speakers attempt to maintain normal social discourse while carefully avoiding direct acknowledgement of their rapidly approaching doom. Discussions of military strategy continue to use the optimistic terminology of eventual victory, while reports from the front lines are filtered through layers of euphemism and wishful thinking that transform devastating defeats into temporary setbacks that will soon be reversed by secret weapons or unexpected political developments. The service of wine and spirits follows elaborate rituals that seem designed to slow down time itself, as though the careful attention to proper serving procedures could somehow delay the inevitable conclusion of the historical drama being played out above ground. Toast-making becomes a form of magical thinking, with speakers proposing elaborate tributes to German valor and Nazi ideology that become more abstract and divorced from reality with each passing meal. The alcohol consumption, while following traditional social protocols, also serves the practical function of providing psychological anesthesia for participants who must somehow continue functioning despite their growing awareness of the catastrophe they have created. The seating arrangements at these final meals reflect the complex hierarchies and personal relationships that continue to matter to the bunker's inhabitants, even as their entire world collapses around them. Positions at the table are assigned according to protocols that take into account both official rank and personal favor, creating subtle competitions for status that seem absurd under the circumstances, but which apparently provide psychological structure for people who have lost all other frameworks for understanding their place in the world. The menu selections for these underground banquets represent a form of escapism that allows participants to pretend, at least during the duration of the meal, that they are still living in a world where such luxuries are normal and appropriate. Multi-course dinners featuring delicacies that require complex preparation serve no practical purpose when the consumer's futures can be measured in days or hours, but the elaborate food serves important psychological functions as a link to a more secure past and a denial of an uncertain future. The conversation topics during these meals require careful navigation between the need to maintain morale and the impossibility of avoiding all reference to their deteriorating situation. Speakers develop elaborate techniques for discussing current events, using language that acknowledges reality indirectly while maintaining the fiction that their circumstances represent temporary difficulties rather than final defeat. These conversational strategies create a form of collective delusion that allows the meals to proceed with some semblance of normalcy, despite the underlying awareness that everyone present shares about their actual situation. The behavior of the waitstaff during these final meals reveals the strange psychology of people who must continue performing normal service functions in completely abnormal circumstances. These individuals, who have dedicated their careers to providing hospitality services to the Nazi elite, find themselves serving what may be final meals to people whose authority is dissolving hour by hour. Their professional training in discretion and invisible service continues to operate, and it now serves the function of maintaining dignified illusions rather than supporting actual power structures. The physical discomfort experienced even in these luxurious surroundings reflects the reality that no amount of material privilege can completely insulate anyone from the broader catastrophe engulfing the city. The constant vibration from explosions above ground penetrates even the bunker's thick walls, creating subtle tremors that rattle glassware and serve as constant reminders of the violence taking place just overhead. The artificial lighting, however elegant, cannot completely compensate for the psychological effects of prolonged separation from natural light. In normal diurnal rhythms, the cleanup after these meals involves the careful preservation of dining implements and tableware that may never be used again. A ritualistic attention to material objects that serves psychological functions far beyond any practical purpose. The washing and polishing of dishes becomes a meditation on normalcy and continuity, an assertion that civilized behavior can persist even in circumstances that seem designed to eliminate all possibility of civilization. The careful storage of unused food items reflects both practical hoarding instincts and magical thinking about futures that may never arrive. The medical effects of maintaining rich diets under conditions of extreme psychological stress create their own complications for the bunker's inhabitants. Digestive problems multiply when anxiety and fear interfere with normal physiological processes, while the contrast between physical abundance and emotional deprivation creates psychological conflicts that manifest in various forms of physical illness. The bunker's medical staff find themselves treating conditions that result from the bizarre combination of material luxury and existential terror that characterizes their patients' current circumstances. The disposal of food waste from these elaborate meals presents logistical and moral challenges that highlight the grotesque inequalities created by the bunker's isolation from the starving city above. The quantities of discarded food represent resources that could sustain civilian families for weeks. The physical and security constraints of the bunker it impossible to distribute these surpluses to the people who need them. This waste disposal process becomes another daily reminder of the moral bankruptcy of the regime, even for those who continue to benefit from its privileges. The documentation of these final meals, through photographs and written records, serves propaganda purposes that become increasingly absurd as the military situation deteriorates. These images and descriptions are intended to demonstrate the leadership's confidence and continued authority, but they actually reveal the disconnect between the regime's self-perception and the reality of its rapidly approaching destruction. The careful preservation of evidence about these luxury meals creates historical records that will eventually serve as testimony to the regime's indifference to the suffering it had created throughout Germany and Europe. The mental state of those privileged individuals who continue to enjoy abundance while their nation collapsed around them represents one of history's most disturbing studies in psychological compartmentalization and moral disconnection. Within the bunker's artificially maintained environment, a peculiar form of cognitive dissociation allowed the Nazi elite to continue their elaborate social rituals while remaining functionally aware of the catastrophe they had created. This psychological phenomenon reveals how human consciousness can adapt to maintain its personal comfort even in the face of overwhelming evidence of moral failure and imminent personal destruction. The daily routines maintained by these individuals required constant mental effort to ignore the increasingly obvious signs that their world was ending. Personal grooming rituals continued with meticulous attention to detail, as though maintaining physical appearances could somehow maintain the social structures that had once made such appearances meaningful. Hair was styled according to peacetime standards. Clothing was pressed and maintained despite the lack of any functional purpose for formal dress. And personal hygiene received attention that would have been appropriate for social occasions that no longer existed and would never occur again. The maintenance of social hierarchies within the bunker created bizarre situations where people continued to observe elaborate protocols of rank and precedence, even as the authority structures these protocols were designed to support dissolved in real time. Subordinates continued to request permission for actions that their superiors had no actual power to authorize or prevent, while those in command positions issued orders that could not be implemented and made decisions that would have no practical consequences. These hierarchical performances served important ecological functions by providing familiar frameworks for interaction in circumstances that had moved far beyond any familiar reference points. The private conversations among the bunker's elite inhabitants revealed how privileged individuals attempted to maintain their self-concept as important historical figures rather than acknowledging their roles as architects of unprecedented destruction. These discussions often focused on how their actions would be understood by future historians, with speakers constructing elaborate justifications for decisions that had led directly to the current catastrophe. The need to maintain positive self-regard required increasingly creative reinterpretation of events that had clear and obvious causes and consequences. The consumption of luxury goods within the bunker served psychological functions that went far beyond mere physical comfort or pleasure. Each fine meal, each glass of expensive wine, each use of high-quality personal items represented an assertion that the user remained worthy of such privileges despite the overwhelming evidence that their leadership had been catastrophically destructive. This consumption became a form of psychological self-medication, providing temporary relief from the cognitive dissonance created by the gap between their self-perception and their actual circumstances. The treatment of subordinate staff within the bunker revealed how privilege continued to operate, even when the social structures that had created such privilege were in the process of complete collapse. Servants, guards, technical personnel continued to be treated as though the class distinctions that governed their relationships were still meaningful and permanent, despite the obvious reality that these distinctions would become irrelevant within days or hours. This persistence of hierarchical behavior demonstrates how deeply ingrained social patterns can continue to operate even when their underlying foundations have been completely destroyed. The planning activities that continued within the bunker represented perhaps the most extreme form of psychological denial. Individuals who could no longer meaningfully influence events continued to make elaborate preparations for futures that had no realistic possibility of occurring. Military strategies were developed for armies that had ceased to exist. Political appointments were discussed for positions that would never be filled, and long-term policies were debated for a government that was in its final hours of existence. These planning activities served the psychological function of maintaining the illusion of agency and control in circumstances where both had been completely lost. The religious and philosophical discussions that occurred among the bunker's inhabitants during these final days reveal how privileged individuals attempted to construct meaning systems that could justify their actions and provide comfort in the face of approaching consequences. These conversations often involved elaborate theological or philosophical frameworks that could reinterpret their role in historical events as serving some higher purpose or inevitable historical process. The need to find meaning in meaningless destruction led to increasingly abstract and disconnected interpretations of causation and responsibility. The physical health problems experienced by the bunker's privileged inhabitants reflected the toll taken by the psychological stress of maintaining elaborate self-deceptions while confronting increasingly undeniable evidence of the situation's hopelessness. Insomnia, digestive problems, nervous disorders, and various psychosomatic illnesses multiplied as the gap between desired reality and actual reality became impossible to ignore. The medical staff found themselves treating conditions that had no purely physical causes and could not be resolved through medical intervention alone. The entertainment activities organized within the bunker represented attempts to create moments of normalcy and pleasure that could provide temporary escape from the overwhelming reality of their circumstances. Musical performances, readings, games, and other recreational activities continued according to peacetime social patterns, but they acquired an increasingly desperate quality as participants struggled to maintain enthusiasm for activities that seemed grotesquely inappropriate given the suffering taking place just above their heads. These entertainment efforts often devolved into hollow performances where everyone involved understood the artificiality of the proceedings but continued participating because the alternative was direct confrontation with unacceptable realities. The correspondence and communication activities of the bunker's elite reveal how privileged individuals attempted to maintain connections with the outside world while carefully filtering information in ways that could preserve their psychological equilibrium. Letters were written and messages were sent that operated entirely within fantasy frameworks, discussing future plans and expressing confidence about outcomes that everyone involved knew were impossible. These communications served the dual function of maintaining social connections and reinforcing sheer delusions that made continued functioning possible. The management of personal possessions and valuables within the bunker became a focus of attention that seemed disproportionate to any practical considerations, but which served important psychological functions related to maintaining identity and status. Jewelry was carefully maintained and worn according to peacetime social standards. Valuable art objects were preserved and displayed as though they would continue to serve their decorative functions indefinitely, and personal collections were curated and organized with the same attention they would have received under normal circumstances. These possession management activities provided psychological anchoring points that helped maintain personal identity when all other identity frameworks were collapsing. The discussion of legacy and historical reputation among the bunker's inhabitants reveals how individuals who had participated in creating precedented destruction attempted to construct narratives that could preserve some positive aspect of their self-concept for posterity. These legacy conversations often involved elaborate revisionist interpretations of their roles in historical events, with speakers emphasizing their positive contributions while minimizing or rationalizing their participation in obviously destructive policies and decisions. The need to believe that their lives had served some meaningful purpose required increasingly creative historical reinterpretation that bore little semblance to objective reality. The interpersonal relationships among the bunker's elite became increasingly strained as the psychological pressure of their situation made it difficult to maintain the social facets that had previously governed their interactions. Old rivalries and resentments surfaced as the external structures that had required civilized behavior disappeared, while new conflicts emerged over resource allocation, decision-making authority, and responsibility for their current predicament. These relationship deteriorations added interpersonal stress to the already overwhelming psychological burdens created by their broader circumstances. As April 1945 draws toward its inevitable conclusion, the contrast between the underground world of artificial privilege and the surface reality of civilian survival creates a paradox that illuminates the ultimate nature of power itself. Those who once commanded armies and controlled the fate of nations find themselves reduced to elaborate pantomimes of authority, while ordinary people struggling for basic survival demonstrate forms of genuine power through their ability to adapt, cooperate, and persist in circumstances that would have seemed impossible to endure just months earlier. This reversal reveals how true power lies not in the ability to command others, but in the capacity to respond effectively to challenges that threat existence itself. The final communications between the bunker and the outside world took on characteristics that would have seemed like dark comedy if the consequences had not been so tragically real. Orders continued to be issued to military units that had ceased to exist. Strategic directives were transmitted to commanders who had either fled or been killed, and elaborate battle plans were developed for battles that would never be fought with armies that had already dissolved. These communications served no practical military purpose, but apparently provided psychological comfort for those who needed to maintain the illusion that they still exercised some form of meaningful control over events that have moved far beyond any possibility of human direction. The civilian population above ground, meanwhile, demonstrated forms of practical wisdom and adaptive capability that represented genuine mastery over their circumstances. However desperate those circumstances might be, the ability to find clean water in a city where water systems had been destroyed, to create edible meals from materials that would have been considered inedible under normal circumstances, to provide medical care using improvised tools and techniques, to maintain human dignity and social cooperation in conditions designed to reduce people to purely selfish survival behavior. These capabilities represented real power in its most fundamental form. The psychological preparation for death that occupied much of the bunker inhabitants' time during these final days created elaborate rituals around self-destruction that seemed designed to maintain the illusion of control even over their own endings. The careful planning of suicide methods, the composition of final messages and testaments, the organization of personal effects for posthumous distribution. These activities provided structure and purpose for people who could no longer find meaning in any other form of activity. The ability to choose the manner and timing of one's death became the final assertion of agency. For those who had lost all other forms of control, above ground, the civilian population faced similar questions about mortality and meaning, but their responses revealed fundamentally different relationships to the value of life and the possibility of hope. Rather than planning elaborate self-destructions, these individuals focused their energy on extending life as long as possible, finding reasons to continue existing even when existence required constant struggle against overwhelming obstacles. The determination to survive another day to care for family members who depended on them, to preserve whatever small fragments of civilization they could maintain. These commitments represented affirmations of life's value that contrasted sharply with the death-focused planning occurring in the bunker below. The distribution of food during these final days created moral economies that revealed the essential character of different approaches to human relationship and social responsibility. In the bunker, elaborate meals continued to be prepared and consumed by small groups while vast quantities of supplies remained unused, representing a hoarding mentality that prioritized individual comfort over collective survival. Above ground, the sharing of inadequate resources among large numbers of people created systems of mutual aid that maximized the survival chances of entire communities rather than guaranteeing luxury for privileged individuals. The treatment of children during this period provided perhaps the clearest indication of different value systems operating in these parallel worlds. In the bunker, children were largely invisible, protected from adult realities, but also excluded from adult decision-making processes that would determine their futures. Their needs were met through material provisions, but their psychological and emotional development received little attention from adults who were focused on managing their own psychological crises. Above ground, children became central to adult decision-making processes, with many survival choices being made specifically to optimize children's chances of living to see better times. The documentation efforts undertaken in both environments reveal different relationships to history and legacy that illuminate fundamental differences in how the inhabitants understood their roles in historical processes. Bunker inhabitants focused their documentation efforts on creating records that would justify their actions to future historians, carefully constructing narratives that could preserve their reputations and minimize their responsibility for the catastrophe they had created. Civilian documentation efforts focused on preserving accurate records of what had happened to ordinary people, creating testimonies that could serve as warnings about the costs of political extremism and military aggression. The religious and spiritual responses to approaching death revealed profound differences in how these parallel communities understood human purpose and meaning. Bunker inhabitants often turned to abstract, philosophical frameworks that could provide intellectual justification for their roles in historical events. Seeking meaning through grand narratives about historical inevitability and superior destiny, civilian populations more often found comfort in simple human connections and basic moral principles, the importance of helping others, the value of maintaining dignity under pressure, the significance of small acts of kindness that affirmed shared humanity. The preservation of cultural objects and intellectual materials took radically different forms in these two environments. Bunker inhabitants focused on preserving items that represented their own power and sophistication. Fine art, luxury goods, symbols of authority that had once impressed subordinates and foreign dignitaries. Civilian preservation efforts concentrated on materials that could serve practical functions or maintain connections to peacetime life. Family photographs, children's books, musical instruments that could provide entertainment during long hours, of waiting tools that could be useful for survival activities. The planning for post-war futures, where such planning occurred at all, revealed fundamentally different assumptions about what kinds of societies might emerge from the current catastrophe. Bunker discussions of the future, when they occurred, often focused on fantasies of restoration, the possibility that Nazi ideology might somehow survive military defeat, that German superiority might eventually be recognized despite current setbacks, that the current crisis represented merely a temporary interruption in their historical destiny. Civilian planning for the future focused on much more modest goals, reuniting separated families, rebuilding homes and communities, establishing basic institutions that could provide security and opportunity for their children. The medical care provided in these two environments illustrated different approaches to the value of individual human life and the allocation of scarce resources. Bunker medical facilities provided the highest quality care available to small numbers of privileged individuals, using advanced techniques and medications to address problems that were often psychosomatic rather than purely physical. Above ground, medical care operated through triage systems that attempted to provide basic treatment to as many people as possible, focusing on conditions that could be effectively treated with available resources, rather than attempting sophisticated interventions that would consume resources needed by multiple patients. The educational activities that continued during this period revealed different concepts of what knowledge was most important to preserve and transmit to future generations. Bunker education, where it occurred at all, was often focused on ideological indoctrination and the preservation of Nazi intellectual frameworks that could justify their political system and historical choices. Civilian education focused on practical skills that could help people survive in damaged environments. Basic literacy and numeracy that could facilitate communication and problem solving. And cultural knowledge that could maintain connections to pre-war German civilization that had value independent of political ideology. The management of information and communication revealed different relationships to truth and different strategies for coping with unpleasant realities. Bunker information systems operated through multiple layers of filtering and interpretation that transformed disturbing reports into psychologically acceptable narratives, to maintain functional denial about their actual circumstances. Civilian information networks, while certainly subject to rumor and misinformation, generally operated according to principles that prioritized accuracy and practical utility over psychological comfort, since survival decisions required realistic assessment of actual conditions rather than comforting fantasies about preferred conditions. As we emerge from this journey through Berlin's final agony, the silence that settles over these memories carries its own profound weight. In the quiet space between what was and what would come after, we find ourselves confronted with truths that resist easy comprehension yet demand our careful attention. The stories we have shared tonight of families huddled in basements, listening to the world above them tear itself apart, of networks of mutual aid operating beneath the notice of history's grand narratives, of human beings maintaining their essential dignity while surrounded by forces designed to strip away everything that makes existence meaningful. These stories speak to capacities within human nature that remain largely invisible until circumstances demand their emergence. The transformation of Berlin from a functioning modern city into a landscape of survival and adaptation happened with a speed that defies comfortable understanding. What took generations to build was reduced to rubble and memory in a matter of weeks. Yet, within that destruction, new forms of human organization and cooperation emerged with equal rapidity. The networks that developed to share scarce resources, the informal systems that provided security and information, the quiet acts of courage that enabled strangers to help one another despite personal risk. These phenomena appeared not as planned responses to crisis, but as spontaneous expressions of human social instincts that operate below the level of conscious political choice, the diaries and private writings that preserved individual experiences. During these impossible weeks, remind us that history's largest events are ultimately collections of countless personal moments, each carrying its own weight of fear, hope, determination, and loss. The careful documentation of daily routines that had been reduced to their most basic elements, its preservation of memory through words written by candlelight in basement shelters, it's the maintenance of human connection through letters that might never be delivered. These activities represented forms of resistance against the erasure of individual experience that totalitarian systems inevitably attempt to achieve. The contrast between the artificial world maintained in the bunker and the improvised communities that emerged among the civilian population reveals something essential about the relationship between power and human dignity. Those who possessed the greatest material advantages and the most elaborate protection from immediate physical danger, prove least capable of maintaining the psychological and moral resources necessary for genuine human flourishing under pressure. Meanwhile, those who faced the most severe material deprivation and physical danger often demonstrated remarkable capacities for adaptation, cooperation, and the preservation of moral values that transcended immediate survival concerns. The linguistic innovations that emerged during this period, the new vocabulary that developed to describe previously unimaginable experiences, the transformation of familiar words to capture altered realities, the evolution of euphemisms and direct language to serve different psychological functions. These changes remind us that human consciousness adapts to extreme circumstances, not just behaviorally, but conceptually, developing new frameworks for understanding and communicating about realities that exceed previous experience. The preservation of these linguistic innovations in private writings provides insight into how human meaning-making systems respond to pressures that threaten their fundamental assumptions. The survival networks that operated largely invisibly throughout the city during these final weeks demonstrate human social capacities that remain dormant during normal times but emerge with remarkable sophistication when circumstances require them. The informal economies that developed to allocate scarce resources, the information systems that transmitted crucial intelligence about changing conditions, the security arrangements that protected vulnerable individuals and valuable materials. These networks operated according to principles of reciprocity and mutual aid that transcended the political ideologies and social divisions that had previously defined relationships among Berlin's population. The rituals and ceremonies that developed around the basic activities of daily life, food preparation, water collection, shelter maintenance, care of the sick and injured, reveal how human beings create meaning and maintain dignity through attention to the quality of essential activities. Even when those activities are reduced to their most primitive forms, the transformation of practical necessities into occasions for community building and mutual support demonstrates the human capacity to find purpose and connection in circumstances that seem designed to eliminate both the medical and educational activities that continue despite the breakdown of institutional infrastructure illustrate how essential social functions persist through informal networks and individual initiative, even when the formal systems that normally support them have collapsed entirely. The sharing of medical knowledge among people with no formal training, the continuation of children's education in basement classrooms and subway tunnels, the preservation of cultural knowledge through oral transmission. These activities represent forms of cultural resistance that operate independently of political systems and institutional support. The psychological adaptations that enabled people to function effectively under conditions of constant threat and uncertainty revealed human mental capacities that remain largely unexplored under normal circumstances. The development of new frameworks for understanding time, space, relationships, and purpose. The creation of cognitive strategies for processing traumatic experiences while maintaining functional capability. The evolution of emotional regulation techniques that could preserve mental health. Under extreme stress, these adaptations demonstrate the remarkable plasticity of human consciousness when confronted with challenges that exceed previous experience. The preservation of hope and human connection, despite overwhelming evidence that the familiar world was ending permanently, speaks to aspects of human nature that transcend rational calculation and immediate self-interest. The continued care for children who might not survive to adulthood. The maintenance of cultural practices that served no immediate survival function. The creation of plans and preparations for futures that might never arrive. These activities affirmed the human capacity to act according to values that extend beyond immediate circumstances and individual benefit. As we settle into sleep tonight, we carry with us the knowledge that human beings possess reserves of strength, creativity, and moral courage that remain largely invisible during ordinary times, but emerge when circumstances demand extraordinary responses to impossible challenges. The stories we have shared remind us that individual dignity and human connection can persist even in conditions designed to eliminate both. That communities can emerge from collections of strangers when survival requires cooperation, and that hope can survive even when its objects seem to have been destroyed entirely.